Polishing Marbles, Chapter 1, Fluffy Pariah. Taken out of context, I must seem so strange. Ani DeFranco. Few little girls could be categorized as mass murderers, except me. It's not like I killed people, though I was probably known as a smiting bringer of death when it came to the ant colonies that populated the cracks in my driveway. It sounds benign enough, like a simple absurdity within a child's mind, navigating the understanding of extinguished life and its permanency within the insect kingdom. After all, most children possess a fair sense of grandiosity. If not globally, at least as it relates to the scale of their human body, to that of a singular ant. In fact, it's not uncommon for a school-aged child to intentionally stomp on a bug with some palpable tinge of pleasure, to hear the crack of an exoskeleton or the squish of its insides oozing within the tread of their cheaply manufactured Kmart sneakers. I wasn't a monster like those kids. I didn't get some twisted sense of sadistic satisfaction out of it all, though I did consider it my sacred duty to exterminate these invading species upon our familial land. In essence, I was the self-proclaimed protector of the Mitchell homestead set squarely on El Blanco Drive. I grew up in an ordinary beige tri-level home built in the early 1970s. By the time I had made my entrance into the world and grew to an age where experiential play is encouraged within the great outdoors, the trees and foliage on our acreage had aged to maturity. This offered a playground for my imagination, and as my mom liked to call them, my concoctions. To the left of the driveway and ants on my growing hit list grew a juniper tree. If childhood could be bottled in smells, mine would be the intermingling scents of fried chucker nuggets and potatoes with country gravy, alongside the gunpowder from my dad's reloader in the den. It would be sprayed with Ariane, my mother's preferred Avon fragrance, and the essence of our overly pungent juniper tree with pea-sized bluish berries. My mom said they weren't safe for people to eat, but reserved for the red-breasted robins to grow strong and sing their good mornings to the world. Since my brother Mark was 9 years older than me, he wasn't much of a playmate, given that his interests were focused on binging light-hearted comedic films starring Eddie Murphy in the police academy, which was littered with cadets who possessed the intellectual prowess equivalent to a box of rocks. Mark watched mindless comedies in never-ending succession, aside a plate full of bean burritos drizzled with ketchup, all while curled up under an Afghan on the black shag carpet of the family room, no more than 2 feet from the television screen. With this rigorous watching schedule, he wasn't all too intrigued with the musings of a little sister, though I wasn't one for tea parties and dress-up. Instead, I was in the bathroom concocting the perfectly lethal mixture of toiletries to destroy the aforementioned ants, which offended my very psyche with their miniature masses. My opaque plastic pitcher in hand, I scoured the marbled countertop to analyze what possible ingredients might serve to exterminate their cankered presence. I went on to combine everything I could find from my parents' grooming products with items like mouthwash, conditioner, shaving cream, and soap flakes, always topping it off with a little of my dad's Aquafresh toothpaste, since squeezing the tube revealed a perfect swirling of colors that felt soothing to my brain. I would then transport this lumpy, sludgy substance outside, adding earthly elements such as torn up leaves, dried seeds from blooms of fruit trees, and lastly, juniper berries, crushed between my fingers to extract the magic ingredient that would bring my recipe to completion. juice from the forbidden fruit. After stirring it all with a wooden spoon, which was used equally for spankings or Sunday morning cornmeal pancakes, I rained my terror upon dozens of colonies, watching the perfect mounds of sand wash away in minty, fresh rivers. Tiny ant bodies followed, first furiously flailing and then motionless. My job here was done, at least for a few days, until they rebuilt, emerging with resurrected sand cities that I might once again smite. Like most kids, I imagined the entirety of the world to exist within the people and places I was directly exposed to, and little else. Within the small white bread community of Boise, Idaho, adventure was limited to my own home, school, Buttree's grocery store, and Capital Christian Center, the church we attended every Sunday. There was an occasional jaunt to the Emporium in Nampa for window shopping, but little else existed within my paradigm of life, as defined by the passing days and growth that comes with them, both developmentally and otherwise. My family was traditional, in the sense that my mom stayed home and my dad worked at an office downtown where he dressed in a tie and carried a briefcase, always promising to bring home the bacon. I was never quite sure why he didn't bring any home. When I was just a toddler, my brother won a shooting competition and the prize was a pound of cured bacon. My dad took a photo of 11-year-old Mark holding up the meat wrapped tightly in butcher paper, grin wide as can be, just to show that he could bring the bacon home instead of my dad. I later learned that bacon meant money, and it was just a saying. My dad was raised on a small potato farm in Marsing, which is about as Idahoan as a person can get, because of which his disposition was always aligned with hard work, respect, and keeping most thoughts and feelings to himself, barreling through life, bootstraps taut with fortitude. He would be categorized as soft-spoken by most, but not because he didn't have a strong opinion about things. He just didn't need to ramble off endlessly, like some folks do, just to hear himself talk. My dad preferred animals to people, classic country storytelling, and foods centered around meat and potatoes, which were always generously salted and served with Lipton instant iced tea. That is until he got kidney stones and Bell's palsy that one time. My dad and I were made the same way. I know genetics play a part in these things and that he and I look a lot alike, except I'm not balding or donning a well-groomed mustache. We were just cut from the same cloth, I guess. Every evening before bed, I got to sit on his lap and watch TV in his black leather rocker. Sometimes he would brush my hair, careful to not tug it too much and hurt my scalp. He felt like safety, warm hugs, and air-popped popcorn with melted butter. My mom is one of those women that wanted to be just that, a mom. She reminded me of this often, repeatedly offering verbal exclamations of her love and how blessed she was to have me. I could tell she was especially happy to have a daughter because of all the fun things that come with little girls. My mom was the oldest of 3 children when her dad died unexpectedly in 1944. She was only 4 years old. Her mom tried to support her little ones by waiting tables at her brother Melvin's diner in Portland, Oregon. But not long after, she remarried the grandpa I grew up with. His name was Ted. He was well over 6 feet tall and strong as an ox, working as a longshoreman, tattoos and all. They didn't have much money, so few luxuries were offered to them as children. This made things like holiday pies and Sunday ice cream or picnic outings especially meaningful. My mom had only one doll. She bore a porcelain face and was treated with great care accordingly as to not break her. My mom often tended to her curly locks, gently placing her on her bed for decoration much of the time. One day, she came home from school to find the doll was missing. My grandpa Ted had given her away, stating she never played with it anyway, so someone else should get some use out of it. My mom didn't recover from that. Consequently, I never went without a thing. Her childhood was retold through my doll collection, hair ribbons, and sashayed drawers. Back when my parents were growing up, it seemed that the world was rich with something people call old school American values. I suppose those same folks who grew up with a sense of patriotism and nostalgia would say that those values boil down to hard work, intact family units, traditional gender roles, and a square meal at the table each night. A lot of people feel comforted with that snapshot of America, but I would be amiss to overlook the foundation of it all, the whole God and country business. I wasn't alive back then, but it seems that at least when it comes to religion, most people had their toes dipped in a church, if just for Christmas and Easter. Even if they weren't God-fearing folk, most Americans could agree on what was right and wrong. The whole 10 Commandments thing. Murder is bad, and so is eyeing your neighbor's wife. Since most families were versed in the whole institution of faith, it shouldn't have come as a surprise that my mom latched onto Christianity and ran with it at the age of 13, except for the fact she didn't come from one of those families. They weren't heathens, but didn't exactly thump their Bibles either. Church spoke to my mom in ways that people wish a muse would when faced with an empty canvas ready for brush strokes to bear fruit. There's nothing wrong with a hearty taste of morals and community. In fact, there was a time when church families held each other up through hardship as an impressive example of altruism, or just loving your fellow man as a verb and not just a convenient, though lofty, thought. But somewhere between my mom's recitation of the Sinner's Prayer as an adolescent and my birth decades later, things seemed to evolve into something unrecognizable. From that old American snapshot of an elderly woman of faith bowing her head and praying for her son to return safely from the war overseas. The farther things swing one way, they swing right back in the opposite direction with equal or greater force. Maybe it was a response to the rebelliousness of the hippie movement or the emerging disco era riddled with the unchristian-like debauchery. Whatever the conduit for this path, it served to form my understanding of the world around me, and even if not for the better, I suppose I lived to tell the tale anyway. Charismatic Christianity and Pentecostalism can be used interchangeably when describing the faith spoon-fed to me as a child, though my mom would argue we were just non-denominational and leave it at that. Despite the roots of Pentecostalism having been founded on a radical expression of devotion exhibited through practices such as snake handling at tent revivals, my mom's hysteria relating to any object even loosely resembling a garden snake, like a shifty-looking twig, prevented her from participating in any tent-related activities. However, she was all about the showy and oddly nuanced way of communicating her belief that Jesus Christ died for her sins, and she was offered eternal life only because he acted as a sacrificial lamb for all of humanity. It would make her weep sometimes, just sitting alone in the living room, choke sobbing into a crinkled handkerchief, thankful that Jesus died for her. She was emotional like that, caught up in the drama of his crucifixion. It's not like it was a small thing to get nailed to a cross. I guess I just didn't understand how he knew about all the people that would ever live and why he would die for all of us, since he didn't know that many people being from Nazareth, and it was thousands of years ago. I was also fairly confused about the logistics of his death really being a ticket to heaven, because what happened to all the people that died before him? My mom said they went to hell, so we were super lucky to be born when we were, or we would go to hell too. There's no one way to raise a child, a formula that spits out pliable, well-adjusted adults possessing enough confidence to make something of themselves while humble enough to know they aren't the center of the universe, that they integrate the fundamentals of the golden rule into their everyday lives, treating others how they would like to be treated while dutifully paying taxes, failing to question the why of it all. That's just how things are done. There are, in fact, many ways to raise a developing mind into adulthood, not all of which are found to be productive or fruitful in retrospect. It appears that the general disposition of a child is something to consider when applying set structures and belief systems upon a family. Some minds are meant to soar out of tiny boxes, even if they're taught that flying is a sin. If it was just for the belief that Jesus died to save us all from eternal damnation, then maybe that would be a reasonable basis for a world religion. But Pentecostalism isn't just about that. It's kind of like an onion. They lure you in with shiny, happy people oozing gratitude for their salvation, but that's just the beginning. There are far more layers to uncover. Layers like hell, demonic possession, spiritual attacks, and altar call on Sunday. In my church, there was an unspoken cultural pressure to perform. Not in a choir or shaking a wholesome tambourine, but by performance I mean speaking in tongues and going slain in the spirit. This refers to a series of events. Some unsuspecting soul is prayed over and knocked on the forehead by the preacher's forceful palm, only to fall into the arms of a congregational spotter in a spiritual trance. Immediately following, a group of prayer warriors are unleashed, speaking over the listless body on the ground in order to receive prophecy about their calling in the church. It might be in the children's ministry, deterring youth from submitting their vulnerable spirits to secular music, or, if they were very lucky, they were identified as an integral player in the upcoming battle between good and evil as Armageddon was set to descend upon the earth. During worship, people rose their hands high in the air as some invisible embrace with the divine, catching God's blessings like snowflakes. They spoke in tongues, which often sounded like some mixture of Arabic and African tribal clicking. According to the Bible, the origin of this phenomenon stems from a bunch of people that tried to build a tower to heaven. This was obviously a failure. God was so offended by this collective project that he dispersed the participating mortals all over the earth, making them speak in different languages so they couldn't understand each other. However, in a plot twist, God created a language of his own that allows for people to communicate the perfect prayer to God about their needs without the ability to understand anything they're saying. This is considered speaking in tongues, or the gift of the Holy Spirit. In the ethos of my church, it was a very big deal. If you didn't speak in tongues, it was kind of questionable whether you were even a Christian to begin with, much less a really good one. At an early age, I learned that my present circumstances weren't ideal, much less remotely comfortable. So I had a preference for living in my head, or out of it, I guess. Either way, my imagination was considerably more rich and enjoyable than most parts of my life. In my mind, I wished to be anywhere but church. I thought about organizing my sticker collection or eating the foods my mom said were bad for me, like cupcakes with real frosting, Kool-Aid, and rainbow nerd candies. I wondered what it would be like to live in a world where I could watch any cartoon I wanted, worry-free that some depiction of magic might become a gateway to demon possession. To trick or treat, even though Halloween was Satan's high day. Or to just simply be a kid that could laugh freely and dare to imagine a future with infinite possibility. I never dreamed of a future since we were among the chosen generation to face the second coming of Christ. I never knew if each day would be my last. Each Sunday offered an unwelcome reminder as to how little each of us as innate sinners had any say or control over what our future may inevitably hold. As worship persisted over 2 long and arduous hours, the contemporary band would get into an eerie jamming trance in which people would appear convicted to approach the mic, offering an often sweaty and tortured prophecy in tongues. This was immediately followed by some other church member, conveniently gifted with the interpretation to translate this divined message. It was essentially a sideshow. I didn't participate. Mostly, I just sketched dogs and roses on the notepaper provided on the back of the pews, biding time until we could go to Pizza Hut when it was all over. But no, it wasn't over. Not until the weekly altar call that was executed with a dose of hearty, charismatic overture. The pastor would offer healing services to the congregation as anointed extra holy staff would pray over blubbering attendees seeking healing for their diabetes or troublesome pornography addiction. But for the poor, naive visitor, this was an aggressive effort at saving their soul. If you died today, where would you go? Would you be welcomed into the loving arms of your heavenly Father, or burn in the depths of hell for all eternity? Have you turned your will and life over to our Lord Jesus, admitted to being a sinner, and asked God to forgive you? Pastor Ken pled with the congregates. Come forward and pray with our brethren and reserve your place in heaven. Accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior and be released from Satan's hold. He rocked that double-breasted suit like a boss, a car salesman for your soul. It's not like he was trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. I think that he truly believed what he was saying, however flashy it appeared to me. I was definitely going to hell. I just hoped to avoid the mark of the beast so I wouldn't be among the damned. I wasn't allowed to say that word, but I sure knew what it meant. The mark could happen anywhere, tattoos, microchips, or bar scans. Any possible identifier could lead straight to hell. Not to mention the concentration camps being built for Christians all across the country. My mom said we would be imprisoned and persecuted, left to defend our faith unto death. I often wondered how we got so unlucky to be the ones that would have to endure all the generalized torture and tribulation, especially since I wasn't totally sure how much I believed it all to begin with. A lot of the things didn't add up to me. Truth be told, I only got baptized for the free slice of pie that our pastor promised all of us kids after taking the plunge. Plush Pippin had over 20 kinds of specialty pies, which was quite an incentive for a 10-year-old. I was a little disappointed with the one I picked. I should have gotten coconut cream instead of peanut butter cup. Of course, I never voiced my doubts aloud to my mom when it came to all the layers of the Christian onion. I learned somewhere around birth that asking questions was a regretful segue to an extended monologue about how Satan can plant doubts in our heads, and my thoughts weren't really mine if I was questioning the truth to begin with. Later in life, she would say a spirit of defiance had possessed me and would try to order it out by exorcism. But that wouldn't be for a while yet. Some little girls drift off to sleep, dreaming of their Prince Charming or performing center stage as a prima ballerina. I feared getting left behind in the rapture. It didn't help that the Bible said that Jesus would come like a thief in the night. That wasn't the most comforting of bedtime stories, since Christ probably didn't intend to be among the boogeymen lineup alongside Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers. Sometimes, as I was drifting off to sleep at night, my bed would shake, even though I lay perfectly still under my blue gingham quilt. I wondered if the trumpet had finally sounded off, announcing the second coming, and the earth was shaking in hallowed response. Or maybe a demon had slipped into my room because of some spiritual vulnerability I created with my doubts crouched under my mattress, mischievously taunting me for sport. Either way, the shaking came and went throughout my childhood and beyond. But so far, Christ hasn't returned with chariots or fanfare, and to my knowledge, I have yet to be possessed by a bed-shaking demon, so perhaps it's not related. It wasn't as if all my time was spent submitting to Pentecostal programming or concocting lethal potions of makeshift pest control. If the entirety of my childhood was defined by these two facts, one might feel inclined to offer me a box of Kleenex and a business card for a seasoned therapist. I, too, had layers. Less like an onion and more like an everlasting gobstopper, which I desperately wished to try since my mom didn't allow them. One such layer belonged to my preoccupation with singing. Sadly, I didn't possess even a sliver of talent for melodic belts. I figure our spirits don't always match up with the bodies we're given, and my spirit fully identified with the curly-haired, sassy, and ever-rebellious little orphan Annie from the motion picture released in 1982. My mom took me to see that movie at least 6 times in the Mann Theater. We ate Junior Mints and buttered popcorn every time, and it felt, at least temporarily, like real happiness. This was before VCRs, so if you wanted to watch something over and over, you had to catch it in the theater before it went in some vault where movies go to die after their run ends. Annie was everything I wished to be. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind, refused to adhere to imposed roles of what little girls should act like, and somehow managed to keep a bright disposition in the midst of unrelenting hardship. I guess I didn't exactly understand that musicals were different than real life, since I kept waiting for people to burst into song and dance at the grocery store. After all, my mom often did just that, singing the classics her mom serenaded her with while she was growing up in the 40s, like Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree or The Sun Is Up, about mourning and chasing the night away. But Annie wasn't the only red-headed protagonist I wished to emulate. Classic SNL had a sketch with a character known as the Church Lady, depicted by the rigid and judgmental Dana Carvey in drag, who hosted a show called Church Chat, in which she warned all sinners that Satan is an ever-present opposition, leading to inevitable hellfire and damnation. These foreboding messages were delivered with quippy one-liners and the fashion sense of a geriatric virgin. While this depiction was fairly accurate, given the whole Satan thing, I spent an unusual amount of my free time with real church ladies in their natural habitat, none of whom wore a center-parted bun with saggy stockings, but floral button-ups with plus-size stretchy pants and a sensible shoe. However, they all shared an enthusiastic affinity for the use of smelly votive candles, silk flowers, and lace-adorned wicker as decor when prepping for their Anne of Green Gables parties. Anne of Green Gables is a tale known to many over the ages, written by L.M. Montgomery in 1908. This story follows yet another red-headed orphan, an eccentric orator of poetry and concocted tales, who was mistakenly selected from a children's home by a neighbor for aged siblings Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, who had remained single, living together on their family land. The two had requested a male orphan intended to be a farmhand, given to the increased challenge of managing chores when aching joints move more slowly as calendar years pass. The two were set to right this mistake, trading Anne in for a boy, but unintentionally grew fond of Anne's flair for overtly flowery speech and desperate coaxing to be called Cordelia, as it was perfectly elegant and far better than plain old unromantic Anne Shirley. Anne spelled with an E. This story had been translated to screen for PBS's miniseries starring Megan Follows in 1985, and consequently a wholesome thematic tone for a church lady get-together where we all donned wicker hats, nibbling on cucumber sandwiches with trimmed crust, and sipping raspberry juice instead of cordial, as depicted in the series. Poor Anne accidentally mistook an unlabeled bottle from the pantry for juice when having her best friend Diana over for tea, and got her good and sauced. This mishap resulted in the tragic, though brief, parting of kindred spirits, only to be resolved with Anne's heroic nursing of a croup-stricken baby, Diana's younger sister. This deed restored her foundational worth to Diana's overly punitive parents, finally able to overlook Anne's questionable breeding, being that she was an orphan and therefore fundamentally flawed. Anne was my favorite fictional character in the world. I suppose it's because she was a touch dramatic and grew up to be a writer. I figured that was perhaps the most wonderful thing a person could become, to share a painting of your imagination through language that others could experience in their own mind's eye, maybe even finding themselves inspired or changed because of it. These parties were always hosted by my mother's best friend, Sue Lester. Sue was also a redhead and a petite woman, categorizable as my very favorite grown-up. She was pretty sassy too, since she was from the East Coast and called everyone Dia instead of dear. She always liked to remind people that she used to smoke when she was a young woman and missed it every day, that she enjoyed each cigarette she ever smoked. I kind of liked her rebellious attitude, fully unashamed of who she was today or had been before now. Sue was the glue of the church ladies that sprinkled my childhood. At times, they would get together for an Anne of Green Gables watch party. During one such gathering, I snuck into the host's yard to greet the most glorious weeping willow. My mom was a long-winded conversationalist, stretching her storytelling far after the cucumber and seacrest sandwiches had been savored. I took this opportunity to sneak out into the front yard and part the weeping branches like a magical curtain to another land, gazing up at the tree's trunk from which all life cascaded out into hundreds of bright green, pointy, and narrow leaves. Sometimes I would pick the flower clusters or catkins off the tree and crush them between my fingers to smell the fragrant earthiness of it all. I wished to live within that tree trunk, communing with squirrels and butterflies, avoidant of scripture recitation and exclamations about praising Jesus. It seemed to me that when people said these things, only a few felt like they were genuine about it, as though Christ's love was actually oozing out of their pores, the unconditional kind. Sue was one of those people. Most everyone else felt like they were following a script, like when you check out at a grocery store and the cashier says, "How are you today?" and everyone automatically replies, "Fine," despite the fact that their life could be falling apart at the seams. I guess that people were like that with God, saying stuff they didn't necessarily believe, hoping that maybe one day they would feel it like the people who radiated God's love out of their eyeballs just because they were alive, and for some reason, super happy about it. The religious framework I was bound to limited the organic fostering of most all possible peer relationships, since my mom only wanted me to play with other kids that were saved. She was certain that there were Satanists hiding in plain sight, just waiting to sacrifice a baby or goat in their basement. She even picked me up from a classmate's birthday party prematurely one time, having caught wind that the child's mom may have practiced witchcraft because she believed in horoscopes. My mom basically categorized all religions that weren't ours right along with Satanists, since none of them believed in the right thing. Where I grew up, you couldn't throw a rock without hitting an LDS Mormon church. Most families in my school or neighborhood were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I didn't know much about it as a religion except what my mom had told me. She didn't consider the LDS to be real Christians because it was a cult centered around people becoming gods of their own planets that they would populate with an eternal spouse after they died. I later came to learn that this was a wildly oversimplified version of their belief system, but as a child, I still wasn't exactly allowed to play with cult-practicing future gods or horoscope-believing Satanists. Given this foundation of otherness, fitting in at school was at best an exercise in futility. I was an introspective girl, thinking little of my appearance. It seemed senseless to tend to a broken canvas. My teeth were painfully crooked, and I grew too many of them for my unusually small mouth. Perms were all the rage, and though my parents were happy to oblige my efforts to align with trends, I was clueless about product or styling methods. More often than not, my layered perm resembled a before picture for an unrealized makeover. I was a little round around the middle, which was directly related to my compulsive craving for lemon ice cookies and sliced bread with melted butter. My peers reminded me of this often with their name-calling, made-up songs, and jeering mean girl demonstrations. I often chose to eat alone in a locked bathroom stall to avoid taunting from the other prettier and therefore more likable girls. I ached to fit in, but at times, my singularity felt like an impermeable barrier between me and the bad things people like to do to one another. In order for a child to be identified as precocious, they have to exhibit some developmental proclivities that aren't necessarily a reflection of what is expected for their biological age. They're referred to as advanced, gifted, or simply special, as stated by doting mothers to anyone and everyone within earshot. When you're around these kids, they seem like little adults, peculiar even. If you don't know how to spot such a child, they could bring to mind eerie, stoic characters from movies like The Omen, depicting a young antichrist intent on destroying all of mankind in his tiny black suit and matching wool cap. Just because a child doesn't have an all-access pass to whimsy doesn't make them evil, even if they have a curious knack for insect annihilation. Some kids are just built with a different set of programming, and their owner's manual is out of print or lost wherever misplaced socks go after being relentlessly consumed by a dryer. When I was 4 years old, family lore states that I sat down at the kitchen table for breakfast when my parents noticed that my left eye had gone completely crossed. I guess that's a thing that happens to kids from time to time. I had to wear a patch for close to a year before finally having surgery to correct it. The surgeon was really nice, like I imagined Mr. Rogers to be. He explained the procedure to me with Sesame Street finger puppets, and I got to wear a hospital gown with Raggedy Ann and Andy on it. Other than my temporary stint as a tiny blonde pirate, my health was otherwise excellent, while my other development may have been less so. Sometimes I didn't catch things that other people seemed to instinctively understand just because they're humans. A lesson I must have been absent for when preparing for my eventual birth on the other side, if there was one. In Mrs. Green's second grade class at Jackson Elementary, we had this exercise in which we had to practice our penmanship with several words she wrote on the board in a homemade workbook bound with stapled construction paper and filled with handwriting practice sheets that had lines and dashes already drawn to get the ratio of curve to angle just right. Then we had to draw a picture of the word we had just written. On this particular day, the first word on the board was sandwich. I remember being excited for my drawing because that was a lot easier than handwriting. I was left-handed, which everyone said made your writing extra sloppy. So far in life, I found this to be a fair generalization. My mom told me that she had started off left-handed, but her teacher made her switch when she was learning to write. She seemed happy I didn't have to do the same thing. I was meticulous about it, drawing a perfectly constructed witch made of sand. I even took pains to adorn her with dozens of penciled specks, representing the sand with which she was sculpted as flawlessly as any award-winning sandcastle. It wasn't until getting my grade back that a note on the page told me I had misunderstood the prompt, but would get partial credit because I put so much effort into the drawing. Much of my life has been like that sand witch. During one lunch hour at school, I sat outside against the brick wall waiting for class to resume while watching the popular girls play basketball. Although athleticism had never been a strong suit of mine, I still wished for friendship in whatever form it might find me, no matter what god they prayed to. The ringleader of this group looked over at me sitting alone and invited me to join the shiny 1% in their game of horse. Delighted with this change of events, I smiled, fumbling awkwardly to my feet. As I made my way over to the blacktop, the girls began to laugh, declaring that they would never really want to play with me, and it was all just a joke. I was under the impression that jokes were supposed to be funny. Humiliated in disbelief, I made my way back to the comfort of the amber brick wall, waiting for the bell to sound off as an end to the bitter playing field of human interaction. Intentional cruelty was befuddling to me, a character defect which quickly categorized this faction of girls as the type to kick puppies and purposely dishevel throw pillows. I spent a year throwing baskets in the driveway every evening until I was able to make 100 in a row without missing a single shot. I had supposed that made me good enough for something, even if those girls would never know about it. It was just between me and the ants, I guess. They were my witnesses, having finally succumbed to our shared residence in a peace treaty. I didn't make concoctions anymore. I started to see evidence everywhere that I would never fit. Hours were spent trying to decipher what makes someone likable, stylish, or witty. Despite my best efforts, I did everything wrong. In my eyes, I was the textbook definition of a buffoon. One recess, as I walked the playground alone in the freezing winter months, watching the breath escape my mouth in a billowing fog of warmth, I figured it out. I must be retarded. I probably didn't have Down syndrome since those kids seemed to be easily identifiable with their unique facial features. Still, I would spend hours looking in the mirror, studying my eye shape and the bridge of my nose, deconstructing the potential for my undiagnosed malady. How sad for my parents that they had a mentally disabled child and didn't even know it. I cried hot tears of despair when wondering what my future would hold. I guess I wouldn't become anything of merit, just a fluffy pariah looking in on a sea of perfectly conjoined puzzle pieces. Luckily, or not, my preference has always been to be alone, communing with the existential and anxiety-riddled questions that I was sure everyone toiled with on a daily basis. I could often be found mulling about the familial juniper tree, picking at the inedible berries, pondering about things such as the passage of time and the nature of one's awareness within the spectrum of reality they inhabit. If this world, in all its complexity, was present before I was born, am I significant in this existence to begin with? Everyone was just fine before me, and if I died, clocks would keep ticking and babies would keep being born. In essence, I'm replaceable. Also, what's the quickest route out of the house if I wake up in the middle of the night with my room engulfed in flames? Worries sang like a constant hum in the background of my consciousness, leaving me riddled with the physical symptoms of generalized anxiety from the moment my mind made way into the understanding of self. My stomach ached without ceasing, and I wet the bed late into my grade school years, a humiliation that further isolated me from peer relationships, as sleepovers were a laughable myth left unexplored. Always on edge, loud noises shook me into an active crisis. As the laundry room closet creaked open with a foreboding squeak to retrieve the vacuum, I responded as a shell-shocked veteran to fireworks, sooner ripping off my own skin than enduring a single second of its menacing sound. Preference was paid to hiding under beds, behind couches, and within closets, driven to the darkness as a silent reprieve. Without playmates, my brother was the only access I had to companionship when he was charged with watching me while my mom delivered Avon orders in the neighborhood. Mark filled our time together with antics that preyed upon my naivety for his amusement, like suggesting we play 52-card pickup, which I inevitably agreed to. This, of course, resulted in the scattering of a full deck of cards, while reverse shuffling the end with one hand, leaving a disaster in its wake. I fell for it every time. Or he would ask if I knew what an Indian burn was, immediately followed by a demonstration where he twisted the skin on my forearm in opposing directions, creating a burning sensation that made my skin thump. Sometimes he would try to convince me that I could fly like Superman and suggested I jump out of his second-story bedroom window or down a flight of stairs into the family room to test it out. But that's where I drew the line because it didn't seem to be a viable plan. If I did have the power to fly, I probably would have known about it before now. Mark made fun of my fluff just as my peers did, pointing out that I had already eaten a laundry list of items, yet continued to retrieve more snacks from the kitchen to nosh on while we watched movies like Caddyshack or Short Circuit for the millionth time. I never got to pick the movie. But there were fun times, too. We would play real card games on a folding table in his room, not just 52-card pickup. He taught me to play poker for Oreos while we listened to Christian rock music like Amy Grant or Michael W. Smith, and we argued over which songs we liked most. One summer, so much time was spent playing cards that we formed a pleasant litany of inside jokes that made me feel like I wasn't so friendless after all. We laughed until my belly hurt, and I felt happy to have a brother, even if most of the time it seemed like I was an only child. Since Mark was a teenager, he wasn't around much after getting his driver's license and doing the things teens do when they're avoiding parental oversight. My dad was always tinkering in the garage or den, tying flies, oil painting, or plucking feathers off of dead chuckers we would later eat. The garage smelled metallic from drained blood and bird bowels, which didn't bother me as much as their wobbly dead heads flopping around all lifeless and defeated. My mom tended to things in the kitchen, phone calls with friends, and loads of laundry. My parents were probably the nicest people I knew since no one else was exactly nice to me. Being that my mom didn't work at a formal job, she was always waiting at the window when the school bus dropped me off in front of our house. She would make cookies or granola bars from scratch with carob chips instead of chocolate, since Mrs. Beasley's health food store said it was better for you. But I was quite satisfied to retreat into my imagination for preferential play. I spent a considerable amount of time organizing the stuffed animals on their shelves in my room, lining them up by size and reciting their names with satisfaction once they had been positioned to my liking. They each had detailed backstories about how they came to be in our family and what their connection to one another was. Everyone was included. I didn't want anyone to feel left out. One time, while my mom was out delivering Avon catalogs to people's doors and Mark was playing Pitfall on the Atari in his teen cave of discontent, I had an idea. Digging into my mom's crochet basket, I retrieved multiple skeins of yarn and Scotch tape from the scissor drawer in the kitchen, heading down into the family room to create a multi-dimensional expression of what a spider web might look like on a human scale. I didn't understand things like refracted light back then, and sometimes a rainbow speck of light would appear on a wall or my skin from an unknown source, and I would talk to it like a friend. The light's name was Hermie. With yarn in hand, Hermie popped in to say hello, dancing on the wood-paneled walls, inspiring me to plant landing spaces for taped yarn. Before I knew it, Hermie and I had woven ourselves into a corner, room webbed from top to bottom and across in angles only escapable by the most nimble spy. Luckily, my mom returned from catalog delivery with her sense of humor intact, happy to rescue me from my own yarn prison while rolling it into a ball for later use. When I wasn't fearing the state of my eternal soul, avoiding human interaction at school, or ruminating over the purpose of my hopeless life within the shell of obvious cognitive disability, I polished marbles. Mark and I had managed to cumulatively possess a very impressive collection of marbles in all sizes and colors, which acted as shiny balls of tactile pleasure. I would pour the tube sock full of marbles into a prepared pool of warm, soapy water in the downstairs bathroom sink, savoring the sensory experience of clinking glass at my fingertips. It was decadent, the smooth surface of each individual marble becoming a collective mass of movable hugs for my hands, a self-soothing experience not unlike what those entranced worshippers must have felt at church. After an extended period of swishing and submerging, I would reluctantly drain the sink and move on to the polishing process. First, drying the spherical glass between two towels on the family room floor, then shining them individually for a soothing compulsory practice. Polishing marbles was a joy that had a way of sweeping me up into a place without time, an escape from the unknown mass of space that lay before me without a map to guide the way, assuming one's fundamental capacity to orient to cardinal directions, of which I had none. There was no up or down, but everywhere all at once, and organizing the scattered rabbit holes of eternity within my mind was somehow simplified while I tended to marbles, like anchors that tethered me to this fluffy body that felt clunky and unwelcome in its surroundings. I wasn't too keen on praying, since it felt weird to me with the bells and whistles of foreign tongues and prophecy. But if I were to offer up a simple prayer, it would be that I could live in a world that wasn't like this one, where people were kind to each other and God wasn't so scary, where I could think thoughts I wasn't afraid of, and that my world might one day become larger than Buttrie's bulk bins and Pizza Hut on Sundays. I was sure there was something else beyond this encapsulated universe of mine on El Blanco Drive, but until I knew where to find it, these marbles would have to suffice.